Hey, everybody, welcome back to the I Believe podcast. I'm your host, Danae Peterson, and I'm also a fellow patient, if you guys didn't know. And I'm joined today with one of our patients from Australia, and his name is Ian. And he's reached out to me numerous times on Facebook just in following my own story. He's had some awesome advice and just really been a good source of wisdom and relating to each other, like on that patient level. But I'm so grateful, Ian, that you were willing to be a guest for our mini series, Living in the Long Middle. So thanks for joining us today.
Well, look, thanks very much for having me.
For those of you guys listening, if you are hearing parts of Ian's story and you kind of see yourself in the story, please feel free, comment where you're from, what your diagnosis has been like. Tell us where you're at in your journey. And most of all, I hope that, from hearing Ian's story, you guys can take a lot of hope and a lot of encouragement from just the idea that, a future absolutely does and can exist for ocular melanoma patients. So Ian, you were diagnosed roughly how long ago? I know it's been more than 10 years, but I want to make sure I'm getting the number right.
Oh, let's see, 2012, I think it would have been. So that's 14 years ago from now.
Okay.
So
So, I
yeah,
mean,
it was,
that's pretty far in the future, in the past.
yeah. And
Okay.
one can still go well over that
Yeah.
sort of amount of time.
Well, let's talk. I mean, you're from Australia. So, I mean, we know from statistics that I think Australia and the United States and like maybe Europe are some of the top, North America, Australia, and Europe are like the top areas of the world where we see ocular melanoma cases. But can you just walk us through 14, or so years ago? What do you remember about this season of life that you were in? And kind of tell us the version of your story, where it all began.
Well, I think the most important thing from my perspective is I am in Australia, what you'd call a GP. In North America, I'd be a family doctor. So yeah, I'm a trained fellow in general practice over here. So I come to this with a significant amount of medical knowledge. And, we get taught about ocular melanoma in med school. And we get taught that it didn't really have a good prognosis and that, yeah, people died from that sort of illness. So yeah, look, it was a pretty scary time when I first discovered I had it. But, I think back to my first symptoms and I remember clearly walking through a shopping mall and looking at a clock and thinking, gee, that clock doesn't look right. So my vision, I noticed, was quite distorted out of one eye. And I thought, oh, what's going on here? And of course, my brain goes immediately to, I've got macular degeneration. I pull out the Amsler grid, that cross-hatched sort of graph paper that we look at and say, oh yeah, that's horribly distorted. Oh my God, I'm going to be losing my vision. I've got macular degeneration. I better, organise to see an eye specialist. And of course, I live in a country town. I know all the eye specialists personally. They all know me. So ring and make an appointment and get in and see them. And obviously I know them quite well. And he looks at my eye and tells me that I've got something called cystic macular retinopathy, which is where a fluid build-up exists in front of the macula, the central part of your vision. And I'd never heard of that, but, I'm told it's due to stress. And that was probably also one of the most stressful parts of my life. There was a whole lot of things going on within my practice. And so it was a stressful time and it sort of made sense. Interesting side note, that cystic retinopathy is well described as one of the symptoms of shell shock. So it was described by veterans it was described during the Korean War when people complained that they couldn't see. And, doctors were thinking that, oh, these soldiers are just having us on until they actually looked in their eyes and discovered that, yeah, this fluid buildup had happened and it distorted their vision. So, yeah, it's supposed to be due to stress. And is supposed to go away after 6 months. So I was seeing them regularly, had a few tests and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, it sort of didn't go away over that sort of amount of time. So I then got referred to a visiting retinal specialist who I'd heard of but never met before. And he took one look at my eye and said, I'm going to arrange for you to see this colleague of mine down in Sydney. And I'm, 5 or 6 hours away from Sydney. And I look him up, and he's in some field that I'd never heard of ocular oncology, which, of course, was a brand new subject to me that I'd never thought of. And I thought, what on earth's going on here? And yeah, look, we did discuss that he wondered if this was a melanoma that I've been talking about. So I thought, yep, this, he said he's going to send him some photos. I saw the photos as well and saw what he was looking at. And it was like, yeah, look, I'm going to be in Sydney. It's a couple of weeks away. And obviously he told this specialist that. And then I was in Sydney, and I was doing something, reasonably important. And during this day, which I'll describe in a sec, this fellow that I'd never met before rings me up and said, hi, my name's Michael, and yeah, look, I need to see you because, you've got ocular melanoma. And my thoughts immediately go back to my medical school training, and yeah, well, I'm going to die from this. And, I was pretty crestfallen. And I suppose that taught me or reminded me of one of the things about medicine, really setting the scene if you're delivering bad news. So Michael and we've discussed this afterwards about, what not to do in medicine. It didn't actually check what I was doing. I was actually in Sydney, unsupported. I was actually interviewing doctors who were about to being selected for general practice training. So it was like I'm doing back-to-back interviews, and suddenly I've been dropped this sort of little bombshell, and I actually had to take a little bit of time out and regather my thoughts and then dive back into it, because it's all appropriately scheduled, and there's like a whole panel of us there doing this for a few days, interviewing 100 people or whatever. Ocular melanoma in Australia is probably a little bit different to America. I mean, our population's a lot less. We're like you guys, we're divided up into states, and each state will have at that time one, maybe two ocular oncologists. We don't have the population to support more. Now I think some states have 3 or 4. So such is the nature of the specialty, and none of them do that full time. They also support themselves with other eye work. So yeah, in Australia, because of the natural prevalence of cutaneous melanoma, which of course is a different illness, there's a lot of propensity to sun damage, and although melanoma ocular melanoma is not necessarily related to sun exposure, it is preponderant in white, Caucasian people who generally are living in climates that they're not necessarily adapted to. So, us being here, there's a reasonable number. I think it's about 6 per million, which is roughly the same as North America. So the population here is not large enough to support ocular oncologists to the volume that exists in the US. So we don't have a whole lot of choice. So I saw one of the 2 ocular oncologists in Sydney, who is also a part-time magician and does magician shows during the ophthalmology conferences. And he's one of the founding fathers of ocular melanoma research in the world. Is internationally respected. And look, he got me in. He had a look at my eye and said, look, this is a very small tumor. You've picked it up really early. It's central. It was only like, I think 1.1 millimeter thick, which really, if you think about it, is not big enough to actually make a formal diagnosis of ocular melanoma. It needs to be thicker. But it had some of the other characteristics, e.g. that fluid leak that made me pick it up. And it also had that wonderful orange staining that we sometimes see. That's sort of a hallmark of a melanoma. So, yeah, look, it was quite obvious that's what it was. And his view, which might be scary to a whole lot of people, a whole lot of you out there, was, well, I think we'll just watch and wait and let this declare itself. And the way melanomas and the way cancers in general declare themselves is they grow.
Aura Biosciences is a clinical stage biotechnology company focused on developing precision therapies for solid tumors that aim to preserve organ function. Our lead candidate, Belsar, is currently in late stage development for primary choroidal melanoma and in early stage development in other ocular oncology indications and bladder cancer. Our mission is to grow as an innovative global oncology company that positively transforms the lives of patients. For more information, please visit us at aurabiosciences.com.
So if you see something small, if you see growth in it, and that goes for things like Mets as well, if you see growth, that's obviously not a good sign. So I got onto a cycle of 3-monthly visits and photography and comparing. And yeah, look, eventually, and the good thing about eyes is they've got these wonderful background blood vessels across the fundus of the eye that everyone has seen. You can see growth against those quite easily. So there's a whole lot of landmarks you can use. And it took about 15 months for, it to declare itself and say, hey, look, it's now, I think I got up to 1.4 millimeters thick. And, it was a little bit larger. And we said, yeah, look, we need to do something about this. And the problem at that time, and the good thing about being a doctor is you have all these chats about what's going on in the world, and you talk about the science of it all. And
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so we use generally ruthenium here as a plaque agent rather than iodine. Iodine is available here as a plaque agent, but we tend to follow a UK European model of brachytherapy or the radiation plaques, and we use ruthenium. Which essentially, rather than, and people have had this, you would have seen the little seeds that you put in these holders that get sewn to the back of your eye. Ruthenium's a little bit different. It's a foil, so that gets placed on the back of your eye. So it's really quite, it's essentially a piece of metal. It's got a couple of advantages. It doesn't penetrate as much, so it really doesn't do a whole lot of damage outside to the tumor itself. The only problem was there was no ruthenium in New South Wales. A plaque that is not so much reusable, but the block of metal that they derive it from costs 20,000 Australian, which would probably be about 13 or 14,000 US. The government said, yeah, we don't, it's not used often enough. We're not going to buy another one. So, yeah, I sort of joined a political campaign for them to buy some of this for New South Wales, which I thought was crazy. And in the end, a philanthropist donated $20,000 for one to be bought. But we thought, I'm not going to wait for this. And I got sent down to see one of the other gurus of ocular melanoma, the ocular oncologist in Melbourne, Victoria, which is another state in New South Wales, which is a hell of a lot further away. So the pleasure of seeing him and having a plaque placed by him. And it's there I learnt the various different techniques. All of us would have had ultrasounds done of our eyes. Danae,
It's a very funny feeling.
do your oncologists do eyes open or eyes closed?
Mine, it's been a mixture of
Yeah.
both. I think when my eye was originally diagnosed, first they had me close my eyes, but then they put a numbing drop in, and I remember, I mean, it's one of the most like probably visceral memory feelings that I have like in my body. Like I have a visceral response to like cold things on my eye because I know, well, at least I knew before my eye was enucleated. I knew what that felt like. That like kind of cold jelly, like pulsating, and it was very bizarre. I actually still see my ocular oncologist, and I have her look after my one good eye, and so she'll do just to make me feel better. Don't tell insurance. She does the ultrasound of my healthy eye just for my peace of mind because I'm like my tumor wouldn't have been found without an ultrasound.
Wow.
But the feeling of having the ultrasound done when you can see, like, because I can see out of my good eye. By the time my ocular melanoma eye was diagnosed, I couldn't see out of it at all. So like, it wasn't like the ultrasound was blocking anything. But anyway, ultrasound definitely a funky feeling. But I've had it both ways, on the eye, like the surface of the eye, and on the eyelid.
Yeah, because I'm sure some people relate to this story when you go and see a different ocular oncologist. And look, for almost 2 years, I'd had eyes closed, and this guy, oh no, we do it with the eyes open here. It's like, what?
You're like,
Why? Yeah, so that was just something they do it differently in Victoria. Victoria, we have this
yeah, for sure.
New South Wales Victoria thing in Australia. So yeah, very different.
So just like for clarification, it sounds like you did end up having brachytherapy,
Yep.
right? Okay. So then when you had the brachytherapy, because of the location of where your tumor was, like far in the back of the eye is what I'm understanding, like behind the macula. How was that? Did you feel that? Like how long was the plaque left there? Like I know some people have varying degrees of pain, and doctors tend to tell us like, oh yeah, you're not gonna feel anything, and
You're,
I felt everything. It was very painful.
speaking American, yeah, you'll just need a couple of Tylenol, it'll be okay. No, no, it is worse than that. Yeah, look, it's interesting. It's different. Again, different things happen in Australia. We stay in hospital for the whole of our plaque basement. I know a lot of you guys would have been discharged and sent to a nearby hotel or whatever. Obviously, that's a money saving thing. Whatever, but no, we
sure.
stay in hospital the whole time. So I was in a ward with people with plaques put in, and yeah, look, it's uncomfortable. I did have stronger painkillers than Tylenol. I'll admit that, but yeah, look, it happens. Talking about other things that relate to having the plaque put in. The issue about biopsies, we're talking about 14 years ago, or at that stage it would have been 12, 13 years ago. Two things come to mind. Firstly, it wasn't promoted as heavily in Australia at that time than it was in the US. The science and the genetics of ocular melanoma wasn't as strong. Technically, a small tumour, central back of the eye, there was a risk of missing it, not getting enough tumour cells, perforating the eye, all that sort of stuff. So it was never really an option for me. And yeah, right at the back of the eye is difficult for plaque placement. And yeah, as we go down the track in my story, it probably wasn't as ideally placed as possible. And it's interesting the techniques that oncologists use to place the plaque, because they've got to figure out, now, where's that tumour? Now, if it's a large tumour, it's quite obvious where it is. And I think they sort of do things like shine lights in the eye and see where shadows form and place the plaque centrally over that. But if you've got a tiny tumour, you've only just got to guess where it is. And then you really don't want to irradiate the macula, the central part of the vision, too much. So the technique, and I've talked to them about that, they center it as much as they can, and then they pull it away a little bit just to try and preserve the macula. It's probably not really scientific, but that's the art to plaque placement, I believe.
But it's...
Castle Biosciences is a proud sponsor of this I Believe podcast. Castle's innovative uveal melanoma tests provide valuable information about the risk of your eye cancer spreading to help you and your healthcare team individualize the management of your disease. To learn more, visit castlebiosciences.com.
It's such a tricky spot, and it's interesting that, obviously 14 years ago, I don't know, does Australia have proton beam therapy at all in where you guys are at?
No, there's no proton beam in Australia. Our first proton beam unit is being built in yet another state. And
because, just understanding the placement, I guess I would venture to guess that, once proton beam becomes available, that tumors in that location would be more likely to be targeted with proton beam, but I'm not a doctor.
Well, it's interesting in Australia there's still some debate about whether they're going to get the ocular adapters, bits that they need to do eyes with our proton beam therapy. But tricky. Proton beam's not available here at all.
So I guess I want to fast forward a little bit through your journey. I know you had this original treatment, and then when we spoke earlier, you also mentioned that your tumor was recurrent later down the road. So it started to grow again. What was the kind of brief summary of that second treatment of the eye before the future as we know it now has existed for you?
Obviously I went on the 6 month have a look at your eye checkup with Michael Giblin, who's our Sydney specialist who I originally met, and then Leanne Lim, who's come into the frame as well as another. They work together as a team, so I've been seeing her a bit more lately. Around 2019, 2020, I had some regrowth. So I had the tumor was obviously enlarging. It got up to about 4 millimeters, which is obviously quite a significant regrowth. And it was quite obvious that the field of radiation damage was quite within where the tumor was, or close enough. So then I went for a different form of treatment, which is certainly not done in North America, but it's done quite a bit here. And probably, if it was available, would have been the way I would be originally treated. And that is external beam radiation, which is, well, we don't use protons, we use electrons and photons to zap the eye. So it's what people would call standard radiotherapy in around the world.
Yeah.
So they've got a radiation oncologist in Sydney that basically is a national, if not a world expert in external beam radiation of the eyes. And I had a course of that for a week, and it was probably the most horrific experiences of my life, having external beam radiation. Because obviously...
No, I'm sorry. I mean, the cage and being strapped down, all of it. I haven't done that part of radiation, but I had the mask made, and it was claustrophobic enough.
So you've got to stay really still, because these beams of radiation have to all coalesce on that one spot where your tumor is. So obviously your eye has to be maintained very still. And so you get this mask device, which is it's a sort of hard plastic mask. It's mesh, really, that's bolted. Your head's bolted to a bed. And they're told, well, the first thing they said, look, this is 10 or 15 minutes, you'll be right. And you get told you've got to focus on this red dot, and it's like, but I've got hardly any vision out of this eye. What dot? So it's like, well, try and keep your eye really still. And an hour and a half later, I was sort of screaming to be let off the table. Well, probably not quite, but it was like it wasn't the most pleasant experience. It got a lot shorter as the days goes on, but I had 5 days of external beam radiation. And my tumor's been very quiet since then.
Well, that's so good that it's been quiet. I'm sorry you had to go through double treatment. I've had a different scenario of double treatment, but I know it's a lot. It's definitely a lot to deal with, especially when, you go in kind of expecting and being told like, hey, this should just be a one and done kind of a thing for your eye. And I can only imagine how frustrating that probably was, just to go through that experience. But I'm glad that you're here now on the other end of that. You did mention, though, because of your background as a general practitioner and just your knowledge around, ocular melanoma from medical school, that when you originally received the diagnosis that you likely had ocular melanoma and were kind of thrust into this waiting period, that you were pretty crestfallen, right? You said that you were pretty, that was a pretty low moment to realize like, hey, I probably have ocular melanoma, and to recognize as a doctor yourself, like what that meant for the future. So like early on, did you have that fear of the cancer, returning or metastasizing? And how has that kind of uncertainty been something that you've learned to live with over the last 14 years?
Yeah, look, I was probably pretty crestfallen, probably for a couple of days. And then I suppose with the inevitability of having treatment for it, the issue is, being a doctor, especially being a GP, is that we're very much experts in dealing with uncertainty, and that's what we do as a specialty. So having an uncertain future probably wasn't as scary for me as it was for a whole lot of other people put in this sort of situation. And also, looking at the evidence around it, the fact that there's no difference between treatments, that prognosis is largely determined by the genetics. And of course, I didn't have a biopsy. A biopsy wasn't possible. And then the question is, at that sort of stage, the biggest debate I have is, would I have wanted to know anyway whether I would want a biopsy, and would that change what I was going to do? And, I thought at the stage, well, no, I probably wouldn't have gone down that path anyway. But that's just me and my sort of decision, because I know that, and I also do psychotherapy in my practice. At the time I actually did have psychotherapy, that you can waste a whole lot of energy on worrying and anxiety about the future, but the future's going to happen anyway, and being anxious about it is not necessarily going to change things. And, I could spend, like we can all spend a lifetime of worry and about things that may or may not happen, and maybe, they won't happen. It would be such a shame spending all that nervous energy and all that time worrying about the future when, none of it eventuates.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you explained that, and I totally agree. I'm not going to say that I don't worry, because I definitely do worry sometimes. I think we all do, but I think giving ourselves grace, like you said, cancer is a kind of a traumatic thing, and therapy is always a bonus. We're always going to advocate for therapy, but it isn't the kind of thing that I like to taint my experience of life as it is on the day to day any more than I have to let it. And I like to tell myself and tell other people sometimes that, like, if cancer doesn't have an appointment, like, it's not welcome. And so I mean, sometimes I put it in a box, sometimes I give it a different direction. But it's interesting, like, to hear you talk about this. And I really think that your lens as a doctor and being the general practitioner, having all this schooling, I can almost imagine, like, that you had to learn to talk to yourself the way that you would want to be talked to if you were getting the news from yourself as a doctor. I don't know if that makes sense, but like, kind of like, we talk to our friends sometimes better than we give self-talk to ourselves. But I can imagine that made a big difference for you.
Well, absolutely. And look, I won't necessarily talk about or maybe I will. The bonus of having cancer as a doctor is that, it actually changes your perspective on a whole lot of things. And yeah, it helps you talk to, your patients quite differently. And yeah, you don't necessarily talk
Yeah.
about your personal experiences. No, heavens no. But it gives you a whole lot of insight as to how to talk about treatment, about cancer, about tests, about understanding things like scanxiety, which, having ocular melanoma, you really come to grips with, not only within yourself, but you see it on the online communities.
Yeah.
And one of the other things I've really learnt about and appreciate about, I mean, when I diagnose people with rare conditions or come across them with a rare condition, I say you need to find a community group out there on social media with your condition, because they really are the experts. Because I can tell you what I know. I can look up stuff, and most people would only see. I mean, GPs would see ocular melanoma once in their practicing career. Ophthalmologists will see one every few years. Retinal specialists will see them one a year, and ocular oncologists see them all the time. But having that group to access is really good for seeing people that are on various parts of the journey. Some going well, and unfortunately some not going so well. But it's really important to hear those voices and get that sort of insight, especially when you're faced with a number of options and you'll get 20 different opinions from hopping onto the chat group.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, community is absolutely such a huge piece of, what I have found in, the connections that I've made through Ocular Insight and through social media, through, the gift that the internet is, right? It can be a little bit of a blessing and a curse, I think, sometimes. But in the kind of gift side of things is finding those people, those like-minded people who are having maybe a similar experience to your own. And I'm always grateful, right, when I'm able to make those connections. So I appreciate that you share about that. So you've been in this space longer than most people in the online space get to kind of be witness to, I think. Especially because I think that the tendency for people who were diagnosed, 10, 15, 20 years ago, Facebook, Instagram, those things weren't really around when you were originally diagnosed. And so the kind of the drive to be online and to connect with people across the world is maybe a little bit lower. But also I think, again, cancer's maybe not, I mean, it's still part of your story, but also it's not like, it doesn't have to be your everyday if you're 20 years out and you're still doing well. So while you've been in this space, right, where you're not actively fighting cancer like all the time, you're still having some level of some sort of monitoring, like, that ocular melanoma is there. It could come back, it might not, but also you're doing well right now. How have you learned to really just live your life in this space? Are there any things that you feel like have given you a direction and just like a purpose, maybe because of having your cancer diagnosis?
Look, an interesting question. I must admit I don't think about that often. The thing about being so far out is I don't notice the visual loss on a day-to-day basis, which, I mean, for me, that's a good thing, other than when I'm trying to do fine tasks where I need two eyes. It's a bit of a struggle. The thing I've lost in medicine is I find it really hard to suture. So repairing, cuts, doing skin surgery, which is really common in Australia, I choose not to do that by choice. So that's probably the biggest change I've had in my life. But I must admit, I rarely think about ocular melanoma other than in the context I'm part of a wider group. So, yep, I see my ocular oncologist every 6 months, and I have my eye examined. I have an ultrasound. We have a chat about what's new in ocular melanoma. And, being on the Facebook group it's also very much a part of me as well. And chatting to people like you, Danae, as and the other friends I've made, and thinking about going to patient retreats is always a good thing too, and having a chat.
Yes. No, I'm so excited we get to meet in person.
Yes, I'll be there in October.
If you guys don't know what we're talking about the I Believe conference. It's happening in Dallas. Dr. Harbour and Dr. C, if you know him, he's a medical oncologist in the UT Southwestern campus, and we're gonna be in Texas. So if you haven't registered, it's free to register. Keep an eye out for more of the information coming soon, but definitely make sure that you register. Come and meet Ian. Come and meet the rest of the Ocular Insight team, and so many more people from the ocular melanoma.
I'll be wearing my eye shirt. My wife made this for me.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, she's very much a part of. Yeah.
I love it. That's so cool. It's very subtle. Like until you pointed it out, I don't think I would have like totally noticed
Yeah.
that like
Now,
that
how
was
many of
eyes
you
on your shirt.
noticed
But I love
this
it.
earlier in the podcast?
Yeah, I know. Drop a comment. Let us know. Did you notice the eyeball shirt? Because I feel blind at the moment. I feel like I was missing out this whole time. I could have been getting lost in all the eyeballs down there. So, Ian, you mentioned the Facebook groups and just connecting with other people. How have you been able to like? Some people find it really difficult, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, is that some people find it really difficult to connect with people in the community because of like the risk, I think, the risk of losing someone, right? Of growing close to someone and then having that risk that they could pass away if they're higher risk, or if, if they metastasize fairly early. There's all kinds of scenarios. And that level of uncertainty, like you mentioned, is something you're used to as a doctor, but it's not something maybe the rest of us are used to as much. So how are you able to like kind of hold gratitude for your experience and your journey as an ocular melanoma patient, but also kind of giving compassion and still wanting to connect with those, even if they've had a harder path?
Yeah, I suppose that, we're all at different parts of our lives and different points when we dive in and dive out of those social media networks. And yeah, I've had some really good friends that have passed from ocular melanoma, and I've got great friends that are still there and still chatting away, and people dive in and dive out all the time. I think one of the great things is all of us are really there and will provide support to those newly diagnosed or those newly diagnosed with metastases and try and help them on their journey. I think everyone does this with really good intent. And sharing, I think, is really good, because being humans, we're very much social creatures. And so we've all gone through a very similar sort of journey. We've got a whole lot in common. And being able to share that online, I think, and in person, as we're about to do, I think is really good.
Yeah, absolutely. For somebody who is newly diagnosed, right, and they are just overwhelmed by this uncertainty, and just kind of wondering, how do I get through this next point? What would you want them to know about the possibility of just living their life after the diagnosis, kind of after the dust settles?
I think it's important to realize that the dust never probably really settles, and it never really goes away 100%. It's always there to some bit. And a lot depends on also people's underlying personality. And, some people are really want to be in it, want to know everything. And other people, it's like, well, I'm just doing what the doctor says. And as soon as it's done, well, I'm not going to think about it anymore. And I think most people are probably somewhere in between those two extremes. So yeah, I guess my advice is, obviously reach out to your friends, reach out to your family, I think is highly important. Relying on an online community is probably not, 100% is probably not the best idea. It's really important that the people that are around you are also part of your journey, and also recognizing that people that haven't experienced cancer don't really understand, even those that are really close to you. And it can be really threatening when people do have particularly if they've got metastatic disease. It can be confronting. Well, it's obviously confronting for the person having it, but it's confronting for the people that are around them as well. And they worry about the future, and they worry about loss. It's interesting. My wife's obviously been part of this journey very much with me. And I don't think she said to me, she never actually realized what ocular melanoma was all about and the risks of, death and metastasis, obviously the reverse order, until she actually came to a ocular melanoma conference with me. I think that was one at Stanford we went to over in California. That was eye-opening for her, because she kept saying to me, I didn't realize what this is, what you'd been going through until I actually heard it from other people. And so, she's got friends within the community as well, as far as other carers and support people and family members.
Well, I think it's wonderful that you've been able to find so much support. And I'm so excited that you're going to be coming over again from Australia over to Texas. I'm excited to meet you. Is your wife going to be joining us as well?
Me.
Or
My
just
wife is a pharmacist, and she runs a number of shops. And of course, unfortunately, she can't leave, much as you'd like to. And
can't pull away right now.
I'd love her to come as well. But yeah.
Well, let her know we will miss her, and we're grateful that she's been such a huge support to you and to other caregivers in the OM community. I think that's one of the things that we really try to highlight at the I Believe conferences. Lately, the last few years, we emphasize what we call a caregiver camp, where we have the caregivers that come to the conference really get together and just join in the online session if they're coming from afar, and really just learn what it means to be a caregiver of someone with ocular melanoma and how to take care of yourself, because that's important too for those of you guys listening. Like you said, our caregivers, our loved ones, our friends, our family, they're going through this, obviously in a very different way from us as the patients, but they are still a part of the journey and a part of the, I don't know, the everything that all of ocular melanoma can encompass. It just kind of depends on what everybody's journey looks like, which, as we know, it can look very different from person to person.
Only help the person that actually has the disease as well. It's just so important. So I would actually encourage as many carers out there to get involved, and do think about coming to Dallas.
Absolutely. Well, I know that you are not only a long-term ocular melanoma survivor, but you're also a primary care physician or a general practitioner, as you said. And this has been a conversation we've definitely had, between you and I on Facebook off and on over the last, 6 months or so, about just the importance of hey, you've asked me, do you have a primary care physician? And I've been like, what do you mean? So just to kind of tease at the future, guys, we're going to have Ian back as a guest to talk about the importance of having a primary care physician while you have a cancer diagnosis. So Ian, do you want to give us maybe just what's the difference? Just give us a teaser of what's the difference in your opinion between a primary care physician or a general practitioner and your medical oncologist who is specifically seeing you for uveal melanoma.
The problem with people with cancer is not everything about them is their cancer. So if you're seeing, a medical oncologist or an ocular oncologist, yeah, sure, they're doctors, but they're certainly by no means experts in other realms of the human body. And often, talking about some of the psychological issues or talking about, things that aren't related, like, hey, when's the last time you had a prostate check? Or, how's your blood pressure going? Those sort of physical things, cholesterol, that sort of stuff. By all means, you should be seeing having someone looking after the rest of your body and your health. So I'm a great believer in the benefits of access to good primary health care.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's just a little teaser. We're not going to give you everything, but do come back and listen to Ian's episode in the near future, where we're going to chat about the importance of having that doctor who helps to take care of the rest of you, not just your cancer. So with that, I want to just thank our audience, those of you guys who've listened. If you've chipped in some comments, thanks for engaging with the video here on YouTube, or if you're listening on the podcast platforms, please make sure you subscribe, leave us a review, follow us on social media, engage with us. We love to engage with you guys across the Cure Insight community, and we love to see you guys connecting with each other. If you do want to connect with people, in an online space that is, not just a Facebook group, we do have a peer supported Zoom group that happens every Tuesday evening. I know for those of you guys in, the UK, Europe, Australia, other parts of the world, it's going to be a little bit of a time zone funk, but it's 7 p.m. Eastern time every Tuesday, barring a few holidays. But for the most part, it happens almost every week, 50-ish weeks a year. And so if you ever want to join that Zoom group just to be able to join and meet some other people in, some kind of an online face-to-face community, we would love to have you guys. And we do offer primary, so originally just diagnosed in the eye, and also the metastatic community can come and just kind of chat in separate Zoom platforms. Just because we know that can be a little bit sensitive. It can be a little harder and darker when you're in the metastatic world. And sometimes when you're newly diagnosed, you are not ready for that yet. So anyway, but Ian, I'm so grateful to you for being a guest on our podcast, and I look forward to our chat again in the future. And I want to just give a huge thanks and shout out to our sponsors who make this podcast and our YouTube channel possible. We could not do this without them and without their generous support of making this platform and this educational resource available to all of you guys as patients, caregivers, and anyone else in the ocular melanoma community. So with that, we will see you next time.